This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Esop. Towards the end of 2022, I went to Soweto where I met a savvy entrepreneur named Charles and his colleague Smanga, who operate a small business that buy recyclable material from households and sell it on to a formal buyback center for profit. Now, the main source of their recyclable material comes from around 700 or so households that they've persuaded to sort their plastic, cardboard and paper waste. That's around 28,000 kilograms of waste each month. So what's in it for the residents, you might ask? They are either paid in cash or they trade their waste as a form of currency into a scheme that covers the cost of a funeral. This means that instead of cash, as a contributor, you get access to things that you would need when there is a death in the family, like a waterproof tent, for instance, catering equipment, chairs, and other things that drive up the cost of funerals. An incentive like this not only benefits low-income households, but also supports a circular economy because waste is being diverted away from landfills. This story is one of the reasons why I'm eager to talk about social and economic incentives as a strategy for reducing waste. Joining me today are my guests, Chad Robertson, co-founder and CEO of Regenize, a company that motivates people to recycle through a virtual currency they call Rimali. We're also joined by Andrew Hartneck, an anthropologist who's worked with DGMT on our Create Change on Waste campaign. Welcome both.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Rahima. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with you, Andrew. I reached out to you in 2022 saying that DGMT wants to commission research to better understand the factors that enable and constrain littering and dumping in areas where they are most prevalent. Now, during your field research, you encountered individuals, companies, and non-profits that are using social and economic incentives to encourage recycling or cleanup activities, like the example I used in the beginning with Smanga and Charles. My question to you firstly, Andrew, is how would you describe what social and economic incentives are and their potential to shape attitudes and behaviors?
Thank you, Rahima. I think generally speaking, social and economic incentives could be seen as a range of social or economic measures designed to stimulate and encourage a particular pro-social or in this case pro-environmental behavior. I think there's quite a lot of research that has been done on this. And what's interesting is that it's not only something that works across the board in all circumstances. It's not necessarily a silver bullet or a one-size-fits-all, but incentives are something that, if they're relevant and they're tailored according to the context, can actually produce some quite important positive benefits. There's, for example, a study in China on waste separation which found that economic inducements were more effective than just social mobilization alone. But there are other studies from other parts of the world which show that it has to be tailored to a specific context. The UK government introduced a recycling rewards and recognitions fund, which gave households incentives for recycling. And they've had mixed results. They found it did help, but also that the municipalities trying to improve their service delivery and concentrating more on specific kinds of recyclables was also effective. And it wasn't only that giving the carrot of an incentive would work. There's also some indication that some of these incentive programs should use not only a bit of carrot, but also a bit of stick. I remember when I was on a particular insurer's program to do with my car, and they would give you points for good driving or take points off for bad driving. And I was quite interested in that process. I'm not still on that, but at the time I could get a smoothie if I got a certain number of points, or if I braked too hard or did something which wasn't really seen as good, then I wouldn't get the points. So a bit of carrot and stick possibly in these kinds of measures.
So a mixed bag there. What do you think influenced the success of some of these social and economic incentives?
I think if we look at some examples from closer to home, the really tailoring it to the needs of their specific context is really, really important. Your example of Umpakati recyclers in Soweto is a really fascinating innovation, because here we had a lot of waste pickers who were bringing waste into his recycling company, and he was getting most of his money through them. But the household residents weren't really participating in separation at source. And there's a lot of evidence, for example, that just separating wet and dry waste in itself is a major win, because you can then find ways of recycling much more easily than if everyone just dumps them into the same bin. But households in Soweto weren't, participating really, but he really made this innovative solution of a funeral policy, which was something that he worked out everyone was really, really going to buy into, because you can pay up to 40,000 rands in all of these materials for your funeral, and also it's costly to join an actual policy. So if you're part of this recycling scheme and every single week you put out or give your recycling for him to collect, you get points and then you qualify. And he's got a tiered level of reward, so that if you only do it once in a while, you only qualify for chairs. If you every single week buy into it, you will qualify for the full package. And I think that's quite a key aspect, is the sort of tier structure, which allows you to get to the gold level and qualify, so that there is a sort of a carrot there for people. I also noticed in other of our research up in Gauteng examples that for people living in townships and informal settlements, there was a church, for example, which would give credit to people who would involve themselves in recycling and litter campaigns and so on, and you could qualify for food parcels and other forms of support from the church. So that's an example of a faith-based organization who are not trying to make a profit like Smanga was at Umpakati, but a different kind of model, but still encouraging people to participate. And then the other example, which was really interesting, was in Salisville with the Solbend Project, who are a group who do voluntary cleanups and so on. But they've got about 70 different people from the community who are involved. And what we saw there is that, it's a major social asset building opportunity too for people living in these kind of contexts. It builds community cohesion, because many of those who are involved were saying things to us like, I come to this every day to volunteer because I'm unemployed. It's not necessarily that I expect to get anything material out of it, but I feel this camaraderie, the sense of belonging, the sense of hope, and cleaning up the environment also in itself is a bit of a reward. So that was really, really interesting. And then on top of that, they do get access to occasional stipends and occasional food and money and so on. But it is really, there's a social reward too in the whole thing built into it. So I think that's a really interesting example.
Let's talk now about what the reality is like here in South Africa. We know that only 6 in 10 households have regular waste collection nationally, and that picture looks different if you zoom into rural areas, for instance. So my question is how such incentives can be used to challenge or reinforce prevailing norms around littering, dumping and recycling, especially in communities that don't have regular waste collection and are dealing with other pressing service delivery challenges.
I think that's a tricky one. I think that certainly trying to shift the needle in people's minds around who takes responsibility for this is really important. What our research found is that there's a mixture of systemic, structural and behavioral reasons why littering and dumping is a major problem, and you can't really address one of those alone without addressing any of the others. I think often people's behavior is blamed, but for example, something we found was that people living in a township context, you might have one municipal bin, which is actually, the assumption is there's one household which would have a collection once a week, but actually there's 3 or 4 shacks in the back of the yard, because the reality is that there's a real densification. And so it's actually, the litter accumulates in 2 days. And so it's just not enough. That's a systemic problem, but it's also about shifting people's attitudes. In Salisville, for example, people saw the dump sites as also a kind of asset, which was quite interesting, where the children would go and scavenge on it for little bits of toys that had been thrown away. And not only the waste pickers, but other community members would see it as an asset. And the other thing I picked up is that there's a kind of what's called by some psychologists a Bader-Meinhof syndrome, where you become so acclimatized to something that you stop noticing it. And it's only when you kind of see it with fresh eyes that you start to see it as a problem. So this guy who founded Solbent in Salisville said to us, look, I used to walk past these dump sites without even seeing them because I was so used to them. In a more obvious or tangible way, I'll give you an example. A courier dropped off a parcel at my house and I noticed, the branding, and I hadn't actually noticed or conscientized that that courier existed before then. From the very next day, I kept seeing this courier's car driving all over the place, and I realized I'd always seen the courier's car, but my brain didn't take it in. So I think littering and dumping, to really get to the heart of people taking ownership of it, it needs to sort of almost crack that Bader-Meinhof syndrome, because, the municipalities can't always deliver the services that they need to, but I think people need to be more conscientized. And I think some of these social incentive programs can really not only play a role in giving a carrot to people to recycle and so on, but can also raise that awareness, not only for residents and other people, but also maybe for local authorities and others who can become, instead of just going through the motions of taking waste to the dump site, can also even reimagine what the solution could be if we thought about it slightly differently.
Andrew, a lot of the littering campaigns place the blame squarely on individuals. Is that a problem, when it comes to dealing with the waste issue, where there seems to be a lot of emphasis on the stick rather than the carrot?
Yes, I think that there has been rather an emphasis on the stick, but at the same time, there's a kind of lip service paid to the stick, and in certain areas there isn't as much. I would say boundary setting is something that's important. We need to all have a social contract that says, look, we don't litter, we look after our environment, we try and be good custodians, and maybe there is a role for the local authorities to play in policing that to some extent. Maybe that's not a nice word to use, but I think that it's gone far too far to the extent of only fining and not offering rewards, or at least showing what the rewards can be. There can be some inherent rewards for keeping your environment clean, and there are champions in all these communities who do that, but often fight a bit of a losing battle because the local authorities just see it in those narrow terms. And you've only to see the no dumping signs around the city, and then you see things dumped literally there. I can never work out if it's a chicken and egg scenario, whether the area was already a dumping zone, which then the city just thought a sign would solve, or whether putting a sign there actually attracts people to dump there. But clearly there's something about the social contract that needs to be reworked so that communities buy into this notion that we all must take ownership. And I think we saw that in our research too, that there was an alienation, I think, between local authorities and communities, such that in some ways dumping can be seen as a form of resistance in some places, where people almost feel like, well, I don't get anything from these guys, I don't really respect them. And so there's the other thing we picked up is that people saying, it's actually their job to clean up the environment. So I think there's a bit of give and take in the whole thing, and for me the relationship is what needs work, because there's a policing on one hand from the authorities, and then a resistance from the people who are living in specific communities. And I think the relationship could be reframed so that everyone can take ownership of the issue and know each other's roles.
Chad, let's come to you, as the Regionise model offers economic incentives for households across income brackets, as I understand it. And I want to know more about it. Tell me about Regionise and how it operates.
Yeah, thank you, Rahima. So Regionise is a zero-waste solutions company, and our focus is on how do we enable and encourage people to live what we call imperfect zero-waste lifestyles. We do this through various solutions. One is called React. It's a recycling solution focused on making recycling accessible and inclusive. We have a concept called Rimali, which is our virtual currency, and that plays the role of the behavior change element in the recycling space. And then most recently, last year, we piloted a zero-waste shopping model called Zero Waste Spaza, which we basically convert Spaza shops into zero-waste shops, enabling their customers to buy essential produce without creating any waste. And effectively, the Rimali part was the start of this whole thing, funny enough. But as we got to realize that it's really challenging to encourage people to perform a behavior if they do not have access to performing that activity. And so hence the recycling solution started, after learning that. We came in the industry as, tech background founders, thinking we can build a tech solution to solve this crisis around, recycling and waste. And basically we found that that's a challenge, that there's not enough access for people to recycle, especially in low-income communities. So we've then got into, after running that for about a year, typical startup founder phrase, screw it, let's do it. We started our own recycling solution because the existing recycling companies were not quite keen to work with us on that model. And we realized as we got deeper into it, there's more and more challenges facing this industry. So we are very much problem solvers, trying to, fix things built for our context in a specific way. And we've been doing this for nearly 8 years now. So we've been around for a while.
Let's pause there because you said a lot that I want to just deep dive into. The first thing that stood out for me is when you spoke about imperfect zero waste. Tell me about that. What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, so for many households where we enter, it's the first time they've performed some of these activities, such as recycling. And there's this fear within communities where people don't want to get started because they don't know how. And as an adult, to say, I don't know how to recycle might seem a bit embarrassing. So we try and encourage people. For example, we make it as simple as possible. So one thing we did was single stream recycling. You don't have to separate by plastic, paper, glass, metal, etc. Put it all together. So we try to simplify things. And our whole notion is you can do something simple. Just get started. We have various ways you can get started. You don't have to be a perfect recycler to recycle, but let's get started.
The second thing that stood out for me is when you said that you had a challenge getting recyclers on board. What was the problem there?
The problem, I don't know. We were young. We just after graduating, my business partner and I, we started this concept. We worked for a short while. And again, we were quite new to the industry. Like I said, we came from a tech background. So we studied in the software space, worked in the software space. So our exposure to the work world was very different to the waste world. And our assumption was, we got a great solution. Let's work with all these existing recycling companies that most likely want more waste. We can be the, call it a sort of Uber platform for the recycling space, linked with an incentive to encourage people to recycle. Because at that stage, I think the statistics was 3% of South Africans were recycling. So we thought, how do we encourage people to recycle? And we looked at the existing recycling solutions, and none of them were very consumer friendly. So they were very outdated, the way the sign-up process worked. And so we thought, no, let's work with them. They need a consumer-facing solution. And effectively, we spoke to a few people, a few companies. They're very set in their ways in the industry. This whole new way of collecting, tagging a bag, identifying, collecting data. No one wanted to hear about that, really. It's like, I just want more tons. That was the conversation. We wanted to introduce a new way of collecting recyclables, and the way was we wanted to identify who's recycling so they could get an incentive each time they recycle. So that was a new operation process you'd have to implement in your current existing process, where normally it's we go, we collect, throw the bags, and we move. Now it was actually, we need you to, these bags must have a code on, it must be weighed, so it added more operational challenges to them. And so that's the reason why. And we understood, as at the same time, we're new to the industry, we didn't know much. And so we also had to get our own hands dirty. And that's when in 2017, we launched our own recycling company. And the whole focus of the solution was, let's encourage people to recycle, provide them a nice B2C orientated service with good customer service, things people are used to these days. We never saw ourselves as a competitor to other recycling companies, but more to other industries. What's happening in insurance? What's happening in banking? What's happening on the entertainment scene? We need to be at the same level as an industry. And so it's introducing things like online signups, online payments for recycling, which wasn't a thing back then. And that's when we launched. And we launched with a lent bakkie, a typical startup story for a recycling company. We were sorting the waste in my business partner's mother's garage. So my business partner at that stage had a master's, and he's like, I can't believe this. With a master's, I'm busy sorting out someone's rubbish in my garage. So yeah, we had to learn and earn our stripes from the early stages. We got to learn how to collect, how to sort, what it feels like to run a recycling operation. And yeah, that was how we enabled what we call Remali to come into reality by having our own collection service.
And before we go deeper into Remali, tell me a little bit more about the Spaza shop.
One thing we've been learning over the years is that not everything can be recycled and not everybody's going to recycle. And so recycling is, how can I say it, further down the value chain if you look at the ultimate solution, right? We want to kind of avoid as much as we can. We want to reduce as much as we can. We want to reuse as much as we can before we have to recycle the remaining bit. And as a recycling solution, we don't have the mindset of, oh, more tons, more tons. It's great to get more tons, but we also have thinking of an environmental perspective. And one of the things we saw a lot was these little plastic bags in many of the communities we operated in. And these plastic bags come from spaza shops where people who can't afford to buy a full tin of coffee or sugar or spice, etc., they buy it at spaza shops for maybe a £2 bag of sugar. And they buy it like this on a daily basis. So one big bag of sugar could make 50 to 100 mini plastic bags. We thought to ourselves, how do we solve this problem at the spaza shop level? Because for us, it seemed quite simple. And yeah, we invented this solution called Zero Waste Spaza last year. It was very much focused on integrating the zero waste concept into existing spaza shops. And what we did was we installed digital dispensers in spaza shops, filled them up with essentials such as maize, sugar, coffee, lentils, rice as well. And effectively, people could also buy on their own terms. So, which is also another big problem outside the waste world is the fact of food prices, right? This allowed people to buy based on their amount of money they have and not opt for something unhealthy, like a bag of chips for dinner. They could now buy a bit of rice here, buy maybe a tomato loose, and they could make an actual meal. So that was the whole thing. How do we encourage people to not create more waste, coming with their own containers? And yeah, I think the pilot was a success.
Where was the pilot?
The pilot was running in a Nova Park. It's an area here in Cape Town. Again, no one there knows the zero waste shopping concept, so it was entirely new and quite a lot of learnings for us. We started off with 3. We ended up working with 1 because, yeah, the 2 just didn't work with us with the right intentions that we needed for the pilot. And yeah, month on month, we saw growth. It was really great. And for us, the objective was how do we take this to the next level? That's somewhere we're still at while focusing amongst other things. And yeah, I think the one thing we did learn from that whole experience is that, cultural nuances are so important to understand in any area. And that's part of the next level we want to go to, because one thing we learned is that for us, great, we're reducing, we're reusing, amazing. For the people coming to shop there, for some it was an embarrassment. We saw 5-year-old kids hiding a plastic bottle under their t-shirt because most likely either their mother or grandmother told them don't be seen with this bottle, because in the community it seems like you're going to borrow. So it's these small things you only get to learn as you experiment, and that's part of the innovation cycle, and that's where we play. We want to be the company that's going to find a way to make it happen, and yeah, I think we've did a bit of progress there at least.
That's so interesting. Hey, Andrew, as an anthropologist, it's these things that you actually don't think about in the design of a project or a business model, but during implementation you learn about these cultural differences.
Yes, absolutely. I think, and as Chad is saying, in some cases you can't necessarily preempt that. You have to just experiment and work with people. And, often what people say they do culturally and what they actually do are quite different. So even if you got someone in to explain, this is how you should work in this context, you'd find it's not necessarily the case on the ground. So you have to kind of learn by doing.
Chad, you've given me a good sense of Regionise and how it operates in its entirety. Let's now zoom into Remali, because that is the economic incentive. Tell me about Remali and how it works.
Yeah, so Remali, which stands for Recycling Imali, which is money, it's an incentive program that people earn each time they perform an activity. Whenever someone recycles with us, they earn Remali. So it's very much focused on building continuous behavior. Initially, Remali paid incentives based on weight originally, which we found was not the best economic model, because someone giving you bag of glass weighs quite heavier than, a bag of, for example, aluminium, but they would be earning more Rimali. So we changed that around, I'd say about 3 years ago, to focus more on activity-based behavior. And so, they can then use that Rimali to shop on our online platforms, so airtime, data, grocery vouchers. And we introduced a new version of that called Simplified Rimali, which we partner with local spaza shops to run that. So one thing we got, again, one of those things you learn as you're operating, we firstly had the virtual Rimali only, and then rumors started spreading in the communities, like, hey, these guys are lying, we're not getting our vouchers. And we're like, no, your Rimali is there, it's just, it's on the website, you have to go and buy it. But for many people, again, they are not able to access a virtual currency, understand a virtual currency, and we had to take it upon ourselves to solve that. We developed an app for spaza shop owners. So effectively, you as a user of our recycling solution, each time you earn Rimali, you can then go to your local spaza, take your QR code or your 5-digit code, give it to your spaza shop owner, and he or she can then tell you what's your balance, and you can use that at the spaza shop for various essentials. And that's fundamentally how the incentive is earned. We've introduced some new things last year on the Rimali app, which effectively enables people to earn Rimali for doing quizzes as well, which is something we're trying to push for the future, pushing an educational element. But we're still at the very early stage for Rimali. We do see that there's a bigger vision for Rimali outside of our own, solutions, where other recycling companies can utilize it as well. We've found that we can use it for various applications, such as encouraging people to reduce more, to reuse more, repair more. It's a great tool for trying to get people to get started. Rimali isn't the only solution required, but it's something that really helps people get started. When you come there and say, can you sign up for a recycling service, or are you interested? By the way, there's also some Rimali you're going to be earning. When we designed our solution, we knew it's going to be something that is mass market focused. We need to design it in a way that can encourage many different personalities to start recycling.
How are you measuring the impact of these economic incentives, Chad?
On a community basis, we looked at unlocked income. So the income Rimali generates in that community is money that's not been there before, which is one of the ways we measure the impact of Rimali. Each time residents earn this Rimali, they then go and spend it in their community. That's unlocked income that wasn't there before, and it benefits people in many ways. For the user, they can supplement some of their income and get some essentials. Spaza shop owners are getting more or new customers who haven't been there before, and so that's a great way Rimali is also creating impact. On a recycling front, it obviously helps us with that sign-up rate. When we go to a new community that hasn't recycled before and let them know that you're going to earn some Rimali each time you recycle, it helps the speed of adoption, which is important because traditionally with recycling, it's very much a social thing. If my neighbors are doing it, I'll also get started, and we see that happening. But with Rimali, you don't have to wait for your neighbors or someone else to do it. With that fear you have about starting something new like recycling, there's a reason for you to get started, which is great. And then from the recycling front, if we're looking at something called an active rate, which effectively means how many of the people who is registered, how much of them are consistently recycling each week. Again, because you're going to earn the Rimali, it helps with the active rate from a recycling front. So we get to see more sustainable activities taking place through Rimali.
And I'm assuming that from that one van that you started off with, you've grown the business to include more vehicles, and I think also bicycles are being used to collect recyclable material.
With our recycling solution, which is called React, last year we rebranded it to React because we were always known as Regionized, but now we had multiple solutions, and we felt that our recycling solution needed its own brand as well. So React stands for Recycling for the African Context. And that's effectively what we've been doing with our recycling solution. Residents, especially in low-income communities, how do we enable a free recycling collection service? Because traditionally you have to pay a fee for that to take place, but we were also very cognizant that it's not the highest priority for them to spend their money on something like recycling. So we redesigned essentially that common recycling process of someone pays, you collect with a truck, and you get it recycled. The model we came up with was a more decentralized approach to recycling. And effectively, if you look at again, any community in Cape Town, there's always some piece of land available, be it through a school, an NGO, and most of these institutions are also looking for some extra income. So we decided, let's work with some people who have space, also very community focused. We all set up what we call decentralized recycling hubs. Effectively, we need around 60 square meters of space. We can set up a mini recycling facility effectively. We can integrate up to 9 waste reclaimers into that model and service up to 1,000 households. Utilizing things such as tricycles, trolleys, we work in with reclaimers, and sometimes also just some unemployed people from the community that we also work with. We train them up on our model, how to collect, how to sort, but most of them do know how to sort already, which is great. And effectively they will do the collections at these residents. The residents we work with, they get their own bin, they put their recyclables in there, the collectors go out, they collect that recyclable separated, it's clean, good quality recyclables, they bring it back, utilizing some sort of transport, either tricycle or trolley, and they have uniforms.
Andrew, a question for you now, beyond incentives. What needs to happen to really create change around South Africa's waste problem? Having listened to Chad and the sort of challenges he faced along the way in trying to bring these innovations to market, what do we need holistically?
Thanks, Rahima. I find it a very interesting and inspiring innovation that Chad's got going, but something he mentioned, which I think is very important to bear in mind, is that you can't solve what is essentially a political problem, and I mean that with a small p, with only a technical solution. You need to address all of the different aspects that I mentioned at the beginning, the structural, the systemic, and the behavioral. And then I think technical solutions like this are really, really important. I'll give you one example which I think is important in terms of solving the problem, which is the extended producer responsibility scheme that has been introduced. It was there for some years as a voluntary thing, and I think major companies like the beverages and so on had signed up for it. But now it's become compulsory. I'm not sure how they're going to make sure it's implemented properly, but it is obviously a game changer because it makes it clear that the producer is also responsible for the whole life cycle of the product. I think also the soft side is really important that he was mentioning, to try and get people's mindsets to shift and to work with them. For example, how many residents know that when you break glass and you put it into your bin, the next day somebody could get a cut on their hand which would be infected because it's full of germs. And, I've heard it said that, when you break a glass, you should put it into a tin and seal it up so that at least, if people are actually aware of the human story to the waste. Something I like about anthropology is they often do these studies called the social life of a particular object or item. And I think there's the social life of waste is something that if people could just be conscientized towards and they would understand where it goes and what happens to it, they would pause, I think, before just considering throwing it away. And it's all these little things that I think need to feed into the systemic and the structural and the behavioral.
Chad, do you agree with Andrew's opening statement about it's difficult to solve a problem with a tech solution? The municipalities have to play their part. There has to be the infrastructure, and then the producers and everyone needs to do their part.
Yeah, 100%. I don't want to get too deep about that topic because I am emotional about it. I think coming from a tech background, literally, that's what we learned, Our journey has been filled with a lot of attempts at working with municipalities, etc. It's different to every municipality. We've been chatting to smaller town municipalities in the Western Cape who's very keen to adopt our whole approach for their entire recycling system. So we're still having those conversations. We're just keeping positive and not being too pessimistic when it comes to the political side.
Andrew, as we conclude this podcast, what advice can you give to NGOs?
I think it's hugely positive that DG Murray Trust, for example, has incorporated recycling and the environment into one of its core focuses, because I think often we as NGOs and civil society get sucked into health, education, early childhood and all these other issues, not also realizing that the environmental and the sort of waste management and those sorts of challenges are fundamental to all of those things, and there are opportunities in there too, like education and recycling. So I think there's real synergies, and that NGOs focusing on health, for example, should also be looking at the environment and at recycling and waste management, and that those looking at education can obviously do that. I've some lovely NGOs looking at practical maths for foundation phase learners who are using bottle tops and all these recyclables as part of their teaching materials. So for me, it's about integrating that into everyone's thinking and into everyone's action, and really trying to make a difference, and at the same time just get it into people's heads, so that what I talked about earlier, that Bader-Meinhof syndrome, where we become so immune to just seeing dump sites and litter, and we also think it's somebody else's problem. We can just overcome that and realize that all of us need to take action.
Thanks, Chad and Andrew. This has been an informative conversation. So if you are passionate about building a cleaner, greener future, and if you believe in the power of collective action and innovative solutions, then I hope you also got a lot from this conversation. And now over to you, those listening to this podcast. Using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps, or download the takeaway sheet from our website dgmt.co.za. Remember to go to the resources tab and find podcasts. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. In this podcast, you heard about the social and economic incentives that are being used to reduce waste. Now consider how you would use incentives to effect behavior change in your programs. Question number 2. In the communities in which you work, what are some of these social and cultural barriers that may prevent behavior change? And question number 3. Think about some of the ways in which you and your organization can reduce waste to landfills. This is DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.